to be talking about in the webinar today are some of the changes that are coming up as ICD-10 turns a year old. We're going to go through a lot of information. I'm going to try to make it as hands-on as possible. So I'm going to move quickly through the next 50 minutes or so, and I'll try to make sure we leave time for questions. So here's what I hope to accomplish today. First, we're going to talk about the big changes that are coming up on October 1st. There are two big changes that are happening as ICD-10 turns 1 year old. The first is the end of the code freeze. We've been in a code freeze for the past 4 years where there have been no new additions, no changes to either ICD-9 or ICD-10. This code freeze was never anticipated to be this long. That happened really as a result of the delay of ICD-10. It got delayed a few times. The date kept getting pushed out, and the code freeze got extended along with that. So we're going to talk about what that means, what new codes are being added, how that might impact your practice, what you should be doing to pay attention to that, make sure you're doing that correctly. I'll share with you some best practices, what we've seen some of our clients do to handle that well. The second big change on October 1st is the end of the ICD-10 grace period. We're going to talk about this. You remember how CMS announced that they would have this grace period where they wouldn't deny unspecified codes for the first year? Well, that grace period is about to run out. That expires on October the 1st, so that's in 4 short weeks. We want to make sure that you're prepared for that as well. Then we're going to talk about some of the short-term and long-term risks that go along with your diagnosis coding. Diagnosis coding is about to be much more important than it ever has been before. So there are short-term risks to coding poorly in ICD-10, and there are some long-term risks associated. We'll talk about both of those and how to know if your practice is prepared, right? Maybe another way, if you want to flip it on its head, look at it the other way around. How do I know if my practice is at risk, right? And then also really where we'll spend the majority of our time is getting our hands dirty, getting into the details to understand what you can do over the next 3.5 weeks to prepare for October 1st. What do you need to be doing? We'll talk about the approach that we've seen that's been successful with some of the practices that we've been working with. And then again, at the end, I'll try to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. So if you have questions, if something wasn't clear as we go through our time together today, feel free to use the questions panel for that, and I'll try to answer as many of those as we can at the end. In order to do that, I'm going to try to move through the rest of the slides quickly. So hang on, buckle your seatbelts. We're going to move through this pretty quickly. All right, so starting off, the ICD-10 code freeze, that expires on October the 1st. We're going to have an update, right, to the ICD-10 code set. We haven't had one of those or haven't had a major one. It's only been like mandatory updates since 2012. So some of you have probably done this before, but this is going to be a bigger change. It's also going to be the first one we've done over the past 4 years, right? And the reason why this is such a big change is there are changes to over 2,600 codes in ICD-10 that are effective on October 1st. To put that in perspective for you, that's about 14% of the entire ICD-9 code set that's changing in ICD-10 this year alone. We've had a backlog of changes, things that have needed to be changed in the code set that haven't been able to because of this regulatory code freeze that are all coming out later at the end of this month. So be on the lookout for that. The majority of the changes are new codes that are being added. Nearly 2,000 new codes are being added to ICD-10. Many of you are probably familiar with the most popular one, the one that has been in the media the most, is there's a new code for Zika virus. That code has not existed before. However, the majority of the new codes actually go along with deleted codes. I'm going to show you some examples of these, but what's happening is CMS is deleting one code and replacing it with 4 or 5 or 15 or 16 more specific new codes. That's what the bulk of the changes are in those. Some codes are being deleted and other new, more specific codes are being added underneath them. And that seems to fit in with the strategy. The whole reason for moving to ICD-10 in the first place was greater specificity, more granularity in the code set. So we're seeing that both in the move to ICD-10, in the ICD-10 code update, and we're seeing that as the payers begin to deny for those unspecified codes. That's where this program is headed. There are some codes that are being revised. What this means is that these codes no longer exist. They're, excuse me. Those 425 revisions are really just changes to the diagnosis description, right? The code has stayed the same. The meaning stayed the same for the most part. They just changed part of the official diagnosis description. You know, for most people, that's a non-event, okay? So these are the changes that are coming up at the end of the code freeze. And let me give you an example of a couple of these changes, what they might look like. The easiest one to understand is the ones that are just being deleted. It's not being replaced with anything. This code will no longer be valid beginning on October 1st, 2016. Valid code today, you can use it today, but it's an invalid code after the code update. All right. The way that our clients are handling that, what they're doing is we have a review engine that works behind the scenes to make sure that they're not coding incorrectly. And so what they've done, we've basically built in rules that identify you're trying to use a deleted code on this encounter. You need to look at that. You need to understand that that's no longer a valid code. It's going to cause this claim to get denied, and we need to make that correction. Now, the best way to handle that is obviously not to use it in the first place. So what you need to think about is, how am I capturing that charge data? Am I doing it through my EHR, right? Am I coding it from the note? Do I have cheat sheets? Do I have doctors who've memorized codes? How am I handling that today? And A, how do I make sure that they don't continue to use that code? And B, how do I make sure that even if one does slip through the cracks, how do I make sure that I identify and correct that? This is how our clients handle this. If you have a rules engine, if you have some sort of code scrubber, if you have a manual review process, you need to be thinking about how are you going to update those to make sure that you're not using deleted codes after October 1st. Here's another example. Example number 2, in the H35.32 code family, we have another code that's being deleted. H35.32, exudative age-related macular degeneration, or wet macular degeneration. That H35.32 is the one code that you can use for that right now. But on October 1st, that code is being deleted. And then there are 16 new codes that are being added underneath that, more specific codes that identify the laterality, but that also identify with or without neovascularization, right? With an inactive scar or an unspecified state. So you're getting a more detailed diagnosis here than what has been used for the first year under ICD-10. So again, you need to be thinking about what your processes look like. How are you coding that today? Or another example that's similar to it, and how are you going to get the more specific diagnosis going forward? And one thing that I would also point out to you on this slide, if you notice, the last 4 choices are probably codes that you don't want to use, right? Those are unspecified codes. We expect those to get denied. We're going to talk more about that in the second half of the webinar today. But I want to bring that to your attention. They are still adding unspecified codes that you probably should never use. I'll show you how some of our clients are handling that, what we're doing to try to help make that as easy as possible for our clients. What we do, if a client is using an electronic charge ticket, an electronic super bill like this, what we're going to do here is on their form today where you see that they have this wet macular degeneration, right? What I want to do with that, when they click on it, what you're going to see is it automatically turns that into the H35.32. There's only one code that's available for that today, right? But then on October 1st, I can no longer use that code. We don't have to do anything to update their encounter form, this template here. What's going to happen on October 1st when they click on that exact same spot is it's going to give them those more specific choices. And if you'll notice, it only gives them the 12 choices that we want them to use. We're not showing them the choices for an unspecified I because there's no such thing, right? It organizes that in a way that is intuitive for them and allows them to select a specific diagnosis with only one click. So think about what your process for capturing this data looks like today, and think about how you need to make changes to that or anticipate the changes that are coming with the end of the ICD-10 code freeze, because you want to make sure you're using the right codes the first time to protect your revenue cycle, to protect your billing and coding staff time, and also to protect your clinical staff time. We want to get that done correctly the first time. Now let me show you one more example that we'll look at of a code that's being changed. In the M50.12 family, we're talking about cervical disc disorders with radiculopathy. M50.12 is being deleted. That it will no longer be an active code. And you can see that there are 4 new codes that are being added in its place, right? A new level of specificity. It's not acceptable just to say the mid-cervical region anymore. We need to say, is it C4, C5, C5, C6, C6, C7? Okay. Again, the way that we're handling that with our clients is to try to make that easy for them, so that when they click on that diagnosis code and they get that pop-up, today they see the choices for mid-cervical region, M50.12. But when we transition to October 1st, they are going to see those new codes added to this pop-up, right? So they can no longer select the deleted code, the code that is no longer valid, right? It prevents us from having that problem going forward. Sometimes it helps to see these side by side. I've highlighted in yellow the codes that are in both of the old custom scenario and the new custom scenario. So you can see that the only code that changed was M50.12, the mid-cervical disc disorder with radiculopathy, has now been broken into those 3 more specific choices for C4, C5, C5, C6, and C6, C7. Again, the goal here is to make that easy for the clinical staff to select the right diagnosis so that the claim gets paid completely and correctly the first time, protecting my cash flow, protecting my billing time, protecting my clinical time so they don't have to come back and answer coding questions later. So that's the big change. The first big change that happens on October 1st is the end of the code freeze. Now the second big change on October 1st, 2016 is the end of the ICD-10 grace period. Now you remember, think back to 12 months ago when everybody was working furiously to prepare for the October 1st deadline, the switch to ICD-10. The big concern that a lot of people had was that there would be a payment Armageddon in the healthcare industry, right? This was our Y2K, right? Claims were going to slow to a halt. Medicare was predicting that denials would double or triple. Consultants were recommending that you get a line of credit to fund 3 to 4 months of operating expenses in the event that payments stopped. That's what everybody was worried about in the run-up to ICD-10. And then what actually happened was that denials didn't go up at all. They stayed exactly flat after October 1st. So how can those two things both be true? What was happening? How do we explain that? Why? Well, a couple of possible explanations. Number one, maybe ICD-10 wasn't as hard as we thought it was. Maybe ICD-10 wasn't that difficult after all. It's a possible explanation, but I think that understates the amount of hard work and energy and planning that many of you on the phone today put in to make that transition successful. We moved from 16,000 codes to 69,000 codes in one day. That is not an easy change. Possible explanation number two. Maybe the data that the payers received from physicians was much better than they expected. Maybe it was much better than what they had originally anticipated. Again, that could be possibly true. Maybe every doctor in America stayed up late at night memorizing all the new ICD-10 codes. But again, I think that's unlikely to explain how ICD-10 was a non-event across the entire country. No, I think the most likely explanation is that we have not seen the real impact on denials yet, that that's still ahead of us, not behind us. And the reason we haven't seen that yet is the grace period that Medicare offered in their joint press release that they made with the AMA on 4th of July weekend last summer. They said that they would not deny a claim because of lack of specificity before October 1st, 2016. That's the 12-month grace period. They also said that that would apply to PQRS and value-based modifier programs, that they would not penalize you for lack of specificity before October 1st, 2016. And that one's important. We're going to come back to that. But they offered this grace period that says, as long as you're close, as long as you're within the same code family, we're not going to deny that claim. Unfortunately, for many practices, that has allowed bad workflows to creep in. It's allowed poor processes to be successful and for bad habits to be formed. Right? I've even heard one physician who said, you know what, I'm just going to code everything as unspecified until I start getting denials. Right? And that's a viable strategy. It's probably not the wisest approach, but it has probably been successful for the first year of ICD-10. But unfortunately, that time is up. As we turn the page to October 1st, 2016, Medicare has made very clear in their FAQs that there's going to be no extension of this grace period, that they will begin denying for those claims, and we expect most other insurance carriers, most of the commercial payers, to follow suit. Up until this point, there hasn't been a lot of risk to using those unspecified codes, but there is significant risk going forward, both in the short term and in the long term. Let me talk about both of those briefly. The short-term risk of what happens if you don't do a good job with your diagnosis coding is that beginning on October 1st, we start to get denied claims as a result of that. The payers want the more granular diagnosis information. That's why they wanted to move to ICD-10 in the first place. And if the provider community does not give them that data, they're going to start denying claims. And when that happens, it's going to slow down your cash flow, lengthen your accounts receivable. Your coding employees, your billing employees are going to have to resubmit claims. They're going to have to go back to the note to find more specific diagnosis codes. They're going to have to go back to the doctor to ask for more specificity. And when they do that, that negatively impacts your coder productivity, your biller productivity, and it negatively impacts your physician productivity as well. That's why your diagnosis coding is going to matter much more in October than it ever has before. We've already started to see some of the commercial carriers do this in Texas and Arizona. I've also seen Georgia Medicaid. They were one of the early payers to start to deny claims for lack of specificity. And Georgia Medicaid in particular is interesting because they took a very specific approach, probably an aggressive approach, in denying anything that was unspecified. Even things that are an acceptable use of an unspecified code, they were denying. And so we're going to see when we start to think about how do we put this into practice, that one of the recommendations we'll make is be prepared to fight back if your payers are denying things that they shouldn't. That's the short-term risk. That's the short-term risk. You should expect to see that next month in October. The long-term risk is there as well. And the long-term risk really begins for most practices January 1st of next year. We're making the shift from a fee-for-service world to a value-based world. That's what MACRA is all about. And most practices will be in the MIPS track rather than the APM track. Under MIPS, the two largest portions of your MIPS score are about quality and resource use. That's quality and cost. That's what Medicare cares about most. Now, you'll probably see this with some of your commercial carriers as well. They're following suit. Some of you may have already seen this with existing carriers, with commercial carriers who have brought risk-adjusted contracts to your attention. And I don't have enough time to fully walk through all of this today. If you've got questions about this, if you need help with this, we can point you to some resources, some other webinars that we've done that really walk you through this. But as we turn the page to January 1st, it's going to be important that you're accurately reflecting patient acuity. And that means your diagnosis coding, that you're using those comorbidity codes, that you're using those HCC codes to show how sick your patient population is, so that you'll get accurate quality scores and accurate cost scores. That is what is going to make the difference for a lot of practices between a MIPS penalty and a MIPS bonus payment. So diagnosis coding is going to be much, much more important than it ever has been before. Right? Now, I want to focus really on the short-term risk right now, and that is those unspecified codes. I'll share some data with you that I think is helpful. What we've seen looking across the country is nearly 1 out of every 3 diagnosis codes is an unspecified code. The national average is just over 31%. That is extremely high. Right? Now, what I want to share with you this afternoon, is how we've seen clients be able to outperform the national average by 3 times. What have clients done to get that unspecified rate 3 times better than the national average? And what have we seen clients do over the last 6 months to drive that unspecified rate down? How have they made that improvement? What are the steps that they've taken? How have they done that? And maybe if we share some of those stories, you can apply that in your own practice over the next 3 or 4 weeks to be better prepared for the transition out of this ICD-10 grace period. So how do we do that? I'm going to walk you through what I think is a 5-step process, show you how some of our clients have done it. I'll give you the big picture first, and then we'll walk through each of those 5 steps in greater detail. All right? Again, if you have any questions as we go, feel free to use the questions panel for that. I'll try to answer as many of those as I can. So the first step is knowing how your practice is doing today. Doing this, what we call unspecified analysis. It looks at your diagnosis codes, how frequently you're using them, trying to see if those codes are unspecified, what the rate is for each of your providers, right? Give you a snapshot of where are we today, where are the areas that we need to improve, how do we compare to our peers. Unspecified analysis is the first step. If you've not done that and you need some help with that, again, let us know in the questions panel. That is a free analysis that we offer to anyone who attends one of our webinars. And then the second step is to work top down. We're going to focus on the unspecified codes that you use 100 times a day, not the unspecified code that gets used 5 times a month. We want to work top down. That's the best thing that we can do to bring our unspecified rate down very, very quickly. Once we do that, and we're looking at those unspecified codes, we want to determine, is that unspecified code appropriate or is it inappropriate? You're never going to get your unspecified code use rate down to 0. There are appropriate times when we're waiting on lab results. We're waiting on an imaging study, right? Well, we don't know what is causing this problem. We're still trying to figure that out. That's an appropriate use of an unspecified code, right? But there are other codes that you should probably never use, right? There's no such thing as a third eye. Everybody's got a left eye and a right eye. There's no such thing as a third eye, right? We should never use that type of code. So you want to be able to look at those and decide, is it appropriate or is it inappropriate? And that will influence your next step. You need to be prepared to fight back against the payers. If you're using appropriate unspecified codes and they deny them, you need to be prepared to fight back. And you want to do that the very first time you see the denial. Don't wait until the problem gets so big that it's impacting your cash flow. You want to catch that and kill it while it's young. All right? If you are using inappropriate unspecified codes, you need to then look at how do you incorporate that into your workflow to make sure that you show your coders, that you show your clinical staff the more specific choices and make that easy for them. We don't want to turn our doctors into coders. We want to help them get paid fairly for what they do because we think that they deserve that. All right? Okay, that's the 5-step process. That's what I would recommend doing. Now what I want to do for the next 30 minutes is I'm going to walk through each of those steps and show you how it works, show you how we've done that with some of our clients so that maybe you can take that and apply it in your practice. All right, the first step is that unspecified analysis. Here's what it looks like. Again, if you haven't done this, I would recommend strongly doing this as a first step. If nothing else, make sure you do this unspecified analysis so you know where you are today, where you stand, how your doctors are doing, how they compare to each other, how they compare to their peers. All right, I like that it shows here's what the average is for your practice, here's what it is for the rest of the country, here's what it is for each of your individual doctors. You can see who's doing well, who's not doing so well, right? A little healthy competition is never a bad thing. But the second part of this analysis that I think is really helpful in going through the next steps shows you your most frequently used unspecified codes and ranks them high to low. So that you can see for this practice, unspecified hyperlipidemia was their most frequently used unspecified code. They used that over 2,200 times in the fourth quarter. I want to work top down. I want to start right there, right? I want to work that top down, try to deal with each one. Then if I need to go back and do this again, I can. Again, we do this unspecified analysis at no cost because we think it's a very important thing for you to do. We've done this for all of our clients. I would recommend strongly for those of you on the webinar, if you've not done this already, that you quickly do this or something like this so that you can understand how at risk your practice is as the grace period expires. Okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to work top down to determine is that an appropriate or inappropriate unspecified code. Let's look at a couple examples. I think it's helpful to kind of put our hands in this and take a look at it. E55.9, unspecified code, vitamin D deficiency, unspecified. Right? You go look that up in the code book, you'll find only 2 diagnosis codes in that code family. Right? So you can it can either be rickets or it can be another vitamin D deficiency that's unspecified. If it's not rickets, you have to use E55.9. Now, maybe there will be other more specific codes that are added down the road in subsequent ICD-10 code releases, but it's not available today. And if you have an overly aggressive payer who says, I'm denying all unspecified codes, and you use E55.9 and you get a denial, you need to be prepared to fight back and say, look, it's not rickets. This is the only appropriate code that we can use. And it's an overreach for you to try to deny that, right? You need to be able to be prepared, particularly on your high frequency codes, to fight back against that, right? So you can stop that the first time it happens rather than waiting for that to happen 100 times a day for the first 2 weeks of October, and now I've got 1,000 little problems that I've got to deal with, okay? Let's look at an example of an unspecified code that's probably inappropriate. You should probably never use this code. M19.90. I see this all the time. Unspecified osteoarthritis of an unspecified site. Okay, and if you go look this one up in the code book, you'll see there are 95 other options that are more specific. But this is the one that gets used most frequently across the country. Why? Well, it could be 1,000 different reasons. It could be that you've got some doctors who used to memorize their most frequently used codes, and so they memorized one code for osteoarthritis, and it's this one, M19.90. It could be that when you search for osteoarthritis, many times in the search results, this one comes up first. And the doctor doesn't want to read through 96 different choices, so they choose the one that's on top, right? And that behavior is reinforced today because the claim is not being denied. There are no negative consequences to using this code today if it's not denied. That's why it gets used so frequently. And if you look at this code in particular, it's unspecified as far as the type of osteoarthritis. We haven't said if it's primary or secondary or post-traumatic. We haven't identified which joint we're talking about. Is this the knee, the hip, the shoulder? We have also not specified the laterality. Is it in the left knee or is it in the right knee? This is one of those that we probably should never use, but it gets used frequently. So when you're thinking about this, when you're working top down, this is the grid, this is the framework that I would think through when I'm looking at my diagnosis code patterns. I'm asking myself, which quadrant does this fit in? If it's in the top right, that means we're using it often, and usually it's not okay. Usually that's unacceptable, right? It's in that top right quadrant. And yes, there's a spectrum. There are some codes that that may be closer to the center. But what we want to focus on is if it's in the top right, I want to put some processes and workflow in place to try to make sure that we don't use those codes. If it's in the top left, I want to make sure that I'm prepared to fight back against the payers in case I start to see those claims being denied, in case they start acting like Georgia Medicaid. And we know some payers will do that. We don't know which ones, but we know that that's going to happen. The payers have not done this before either. This is new to them. They're learning just as you are learning. So you want to be prepared. I hope that doesn't happen with any of your payers, but I want you to be on the lookout for it in case it does. And I want to work everything in the top half before I start worrying about anything in the bottom half. I want to focus and work that top down to identify if that's an inappropriate unspecified code or if it's an appropriate unspecified code. All right? Let's look at a few examples that I think will be helpful, particularly when we're thinking about the ones that fit into that top right quadrant. I'll go back to that unspecified analysis, and let's look at unspecified hyperlipidemia, since it was the #1 on this list. Again, I'll show you how some of our clients who've been able to significantly reduce their unspecified rate, how they've done that. Right? They used to have a template, they used to have an encounter form that would give them the option for hyperlipidemia of E78.4 and E78.5. They didn't want to use those codes. They wanted to be more specific. So what they did was they took the codes in their alternate list here, and they added that to the custom scenario. We worked with them to build that out and organize it in a way that gave them the more specific choices. And we always recommend trying to put unspecified at the bottom. Right? Google has trained us to expect that we're looking for the right answer at the top of the list, and we don't want unspecified to be up at the top of the list. Right? That makes it too easy for our doctors to select that code when we don't want to be using the unspecified code. Right? So that's one example of how a client has fixed, how they've solved that particular problem. Let's look at example number 2. All right? We're going to look at that osteoarthritis example. If you see it up in the top right. I'm going to click on osteoarthritis. Today, it automatically converts that M17.9, the code that I don't want to use. That's what they were doing before. How did they fix it? Well, what they did was they changed that custom scenario in our application. Think about how you might change this in your workflow, right? Whether you're using cheat sheets, whether you're using your EHR to do this, or whether you've got coders that are coding, you need to think about how they can be more specific. How do you organize that to make it easy for the doctors? What this group did, they leveraged some data that shows osteoarthritis is most frequently in the knee, far and above any other joint. So they wanted to bring that to the doctor's attention front and center. Now they could change to any other joint through the drop down at the top, but it made it easy for them to see, this is for the knee, is it primary, secondary, or post-traumatic, and is it left, right, or bilateral? Don't give them the choice for unspecified knee, because we don't want them to use that code, right? Now this is part art, part science. You may have different people disagree about how they want to lay this out, how they want to design it. I've seen another client that for the exact same scenario of osteoarthritis, what they did was they wanted to break that out and include all of the different joints. And so they organized it like this to show them all those choices in one pop-up. All right, what we're trying to do here is make it easy for the clinical staff to get the right code the first time, so that we're prepared when the payers start to crack down and deny these unspecified codes. I'll show you another example of how they built this in on the back end. This client has their doctors going through the template in their EHR, capturing the charge data that way, which they then send to White Plume through a coding engine. We review all of this data before it posts to the practice management system. And what they started doing was building in some custom rules. And they started building in the custom rules, again, top down. It says, when I see that unspecified hyperlipidemia code, E78.5, I want you to stop my user. I want you to tell them that this is an unspecified code, that it might cause a denial. And here are the more specific codes that we should be using instead. So it tells them, so when the user sees that, what they see is something like this. There's E78.5 as a diagnosis code on this encounter, and here's the rule that fires that tells them not only what's wrong, but some of the alternative codes that they should be considering. Obviously, the documentation still has to support this. Documentation is always king, but this is trying to put a tool in the revenue cycle team's hands so that they don't get a denial, that they correct this before it ever causes a denial from the payer. That's what we're trying to do here. And that's the process that we want to go through, right? It starts with the unspecified analysis. Then we want to work top down. We're going to take our most frequently used unspecified codes and decide, is that an acceptable unspecified code or not? Is that something that I need to be prepared to fight back against the payer? Or is it something that I need to change in my workflow to make sure that we don't use that code? Right? Our clients who have been able to work through those 5 steps have seen remarkable results. Right? They are outperforming their peers, 300% better than their peers, and they've been able to take an already outstanding unspecified rate and drive it even lower over the past 6 months. I hope that give you some good food for thought about what you should be doing or what you might want to be doing over the next 3-4 weeks as we come up on the first birthday of ICD-10. Now let me give you just a couple of quick takeaways from today. I hope that this will be helpful for you, and then I'll try to answer as many questions as I can. What happens on October 1st this year? We had a big year last year on October 1st. What happens this year is we see the end of that code freeze, right? We're going to have 2,600 codes added to the ICD-10 code set, or changed in the ICD-10 code set this year. We also see the end of the ICD-10 grace period, where Medicare and commercial carriers will begin denying claims for lack of specificity. And what that means is that there are short-term and long-term consequences to your diagnosis coding. Your diagnosis coding will be much more important going forward than it ever has been before. You have the risk of denied claims beginning in October, and then you have the risk-adjusted coding for MIPS that begins in January. You want to make sure that you're prepared for that, so that you're being proactive rather than trying to catch up from behind. I'd recommend doing the unspecified analysis if you haven't already. Again, there's not a charge for that. If you'd like to do that, let me know in the questions panel, and I'll have somebody get in touch with you to get that back to you very, very quickly. But you want to know what codes you're using. You want to know what unspecified codes you're using most frequently so that you can work those top down. So that you'll be prepared to fight back against the payers if they take an overly aggressive stance, and so that you can prevent and correct those unspecified codes that you shouldn't be using. And the key there is to make that easy for your doctors. Make it just as easy for them to select the right code as it is for them to select the wrong code. That'll give your revenue cycle team the data that they need to get the claim paid completely and correctly the very first time. And that's the goal. All right. I hope that that is helpful for you. I know we've covered a lot of ground, and I went through that very, very quickly. Let me try to open that questions panel and see what questions we have, and I'll try to answer as many of those as